if you win your appeal, the price is set for like 3 years. Would that stay in place?
That will stay in place, yes.
When would this take effect, if it passes?
Well, there are different parts of it that will take effect at different times, but the majority of the bill would take effect, well, the law will go into effect July 1st. But, you know, of course, most of the taxing measures don't start until January 1st.
For many years, you know, property values, you could argue, were too low because they never seemed to rise when I would look at them anywhere near the market value. And now we're making changes based on a very odd economy. What is going to be the effect of when these changes are implemented, when you're kind of tailoring it to a really far down market, when everything kind of starts to go back to normal? You know, I'm curious,
Well,
you know, how do you tailor the bill here and then have it work in normal times as well?
Well, I would say this, if we're going to have a tax system based on property values, then we ought to at least be able to rely that those property values are going to be very close to market value at all given times. Good market and bad market. That's only fair. One of the problems you have in a lot of counties, and I'll take my own county for example. In the southern part of my county, which is rather dense in Cherokee County, you had assessments being changed every single year because there's a lot of sales. In the northern part of the county, which remains somewhat rural, because there weren't a lot of comparable sales, some of those values would just remain the same 3, 4, 5 years. That's not really fair either. Everybody ought to be treated the same. We ought to get as close to fair market value as we possibly can. I know the Lieutenant Governor has talked about legislation that would require an annual reassessment. I don't know if we're quite there yet, only because that would take enormous effort to do that. But people ought to be able to be able to trust that the value of their assessment, good times and bad, is market value, or at least as close as we can possibly get to market value.
But to follow up on that, what if you buy that $50,000 home now across from Turner Field, and in 5 years you just can't afford the property tax because it's become this hot neighborhood and you're stuck?
Well, that's why we need to get rid of the property tax altogether. I mean, you honestly hit on why I've gone after this as strong as I have. It is the most regressive tax out there because there is no relationship between a person's ability to pay and the tax itself. I mean, on your property tax, if you lose your job and you have no income, you still are required to pay it. On the sales tax, if you don't have any money, you can't pay any sales tax. And on the income tax, if you don't have an income, you can't pay income tax. But on the property tax, there's no relation between a person's ability to pay and the tax bill. Now, some people will claim, well, they can just sell their house. Well, what if you live, I mean, what if you're in a situation where now the value is below what your mortgage is? You can't sell it. I mean, you're stuck. And I would bring up Clayton County, for example, because of the situation with the school system. I don't think you have a clamoring of a lot of parents that want to move into Clayton County and say, this is where I want my children educated. Consequently, values in Clayton County are in many cases below what a person may owe on the mortgage. So now they're truly stuck because they can't sell the property for even what they owe on it. That is the evilness of the property tax system. There's no relationship between that and a person's ability to pay.
So how does this bill address that problem, or does it?
It doesn't. Give me some time. We'll get there eventually. I talk about this everywhere I go in literally almost every speech, and I try to point out the inequities of a system where one's ability to pay and what one owes, there's no connection. And I think people get it. And again, remember, this whole property tax system was based on a 19th century agrarian economy where a person's wealth was determined by how much land they had, because that's what kind of produce they could produce. And we don't live in that economy anymore, so hopefully we'll get rid of that. Okay.
Does this bill impose any penalties on counties that fail to comply, and does it require a certain set of a certain skill set of county tax assessors?
Well, two of the things, I'll answer that in two parts. One of the problems we have in the state is that the rules and regulations for Board of Assessors and Board of Equalization have not been changed in decades. We're going to require every 5 years at a minimum that those rules and regulations be reviewed and renewed, and that they be placed online so everybody can see them. So hopefully we're going to get better training, because that is one of the problems. What was the first part of your question?
Penalties for counties.
Oh, penalties. One of the interesting things, if you recall, last year we passed a bill that created an alternative mechanism for appealing one's property tax, in which you could hire an appraiser and then give the appraiser value, and they could accept it or not. And then if they didn't accept it, you would automatically go to arbitration. It would be a baseball-type arbitration. We've heard great success from that. One of the parts of that law that I did not consider at the time was, what happens when you give your appraisal to the county and they simply do nothing? we didn't put any, there was no mechanism in there forcing them to actually do something. So we have heard, and again, this is anecdotal, but it came up in our study committee, particularly in DeKalb County, that you had people availing themselves of this. They would go out and hire the appraiser, they would get the value, they would give it to the assessor and say, this is what I believe the value to be, and the assessor just simply wouldn't respond. So now we're saying that the assessor has to respond within a certain time period. It's either 30 or 45 days, and if they don't, then the property owner's value stands. What the property owner gave as the value has to stand if the government's not going to respond to you when you make a legitimate approach to appeal a value. So there are some of those in the bill, just timelines saying you got to do this within a certain amount of period of time, and again, that just brings fairness and equity back to the system.
Nope.
This will have to be my last one because I got a caucus waiting on me.
All right, would you be in favor, or does it include any sort of circuit breakers for local governments that may see, if appraisal drops 80%, that's a lot for the government to swallow too. But is there any way to ratchet it down, or would you favor that?
No, I mean, look, we have to look at this from the perspective of the taxpayer. And if someone's telling me that I am required now by law to pay a tax on a value that I don't owe or a value I don't have, that's just wrong. No state can stand for that. And that's fundamentally wrong. So the local governments, of course, have the right to change the millage rate. But I will say this, as a taxpayer, now me who studies the property tax system and all this, really looks into the intricacies of it. Yes, I look at assessed value and I get frustrated. But the average taxpayer, they don't really care what the assessed value is. They care what their tax bill says. So if their assessed value comes down and yet millage rate goes up, but their tax bill still went down, I think for the most part they're not really going to complain about that. Because at the end of the day, it's what's coming out of your pocket.
Senator, one quick question,
Yeah.
if I may, a different subject, I was waiting. What about the sales tax situation? There is more and more attention now to the fact that there could be millions of dollars going through the cracks. If you look at other states like Alabama and all, they have found extra revenues there of people that are not paying. What do you think about whether that should be changed?
Well, look, we're going to continue to rely as governments, state and local, on sales tax. So I think we need to do everything we can to perfect the sales tax system. Some of the things Alabama has done has been very beneficial to them. I want to commend the Department of Revenue in the last year. There's been these joint projects around the state with certain cities and counties locating taxpayers, businesses who may be collecting sales tax but not remitting them. And I hope that's the process that we continue to use. I know the chairman of the Ways and Means Committee is very interested in this, and I support him in that. Look, if you're not paying your taxes, you got to pay your taxes. But with the property tax, if you're being forced to pay a tax you don't owe, that's just as bad. So we've got to solve that problem as well. Thank you guys for being here.